Hello, hello. Welcome to the End Evil podcast. This is Chris Jansen. I like to remind folks that evil is the destruction of freedom. That comes from the book, The End of All Evil by Jeremy Locke, which was my inspiration for the End Evil podcast. And there's a lot of nuggets of wisdom and learning in that book. So I recommend people to find the free PDF download and download The End of All Evil by Jeremy Locke. It's a quick read and has a lot of great information in it and thoughts to think about. And talk about great information and thoughts to think about. I just recently made this connection with Colin E. Davis. Thanks so much for joining me today, Colin. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, great to be with you.
Yeah. I saw you meeting with Derek and Leslie, and after her conversation with you and Melissa, Leslie was just so excited, and she was telling me all about all these wonderful people she met. And then we had a quick interaction on Facebook, and I got you for an interview, and it was very kind of you to make such a quick appointment to meet with me. And you sent me a download of your book, which I've gotten started on, but I'm not a fast reader, I'll admit. So
yeah, I'm not either.
I'm going to have you tell me a lot more about it in this episode. But
sure,
go ahead and just brief, as brief as you want to be, long if you want. Introduce yourself and tell people about Shadow Tech Alchemy.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm a musician. I mean, I'm an artist. I'm a musician. I'm a extreme metal musician. I have a death metal band called Vile. And that's kind of my, I'm 54 now. And I'd say through all the way up till about age 35, I was mainly interested in making music, writing, recording music. I became an audio engineer. That's how I've made my living, is as a professional audio engineer. And then after I was quote unquote red pilled in 2005, I think it was, to 9/11 and all the whole 9/11 truth movement and all of that took me down the rabbit hole, so to speak. And then I started investigating all of that stuff. Like I told you before we started recording, I found an earlier version of the natural law movement and all of that. And I participated in some of these groups. I was a coach in one of these groups. And then through that, it's kind of interesting how I got involved in this, but I ended up being I self-trained myself to be an expert in mortgage foreclosure litigation, and especially in securitized mortgage foreclosure litigation. And that's the study of how home mortgages are securitized on Wall Street, how they're bundled, and how they're inserted into trusts, and then the trusts act, on behalf of the bondholders, and there's all this complicated circuitry for how mortgages get wound up in these Wall Street trusts, and then how does that work out, in court when there's a dispute or whatever it is. And so,
what year did you get going in that? I hate to interrupt, but I just got really curious because I was thinking about some of the big changes since 9/11.
Well, there's a whole wave of foreclosures that happened after the 2008 financial crisis.
Which 2008 hit me pretty hard. What was that? So had you started doing that work before that or after that?
No, before that, I was just doing all this 9/11 research.
Okay.
And I was going down and looking at all of the hidden corruption of the so-called deep state and all that stuff. And also finding, all kinds of esoteric stuff, and Jordan Maxwell and Alex Jones and all that stuff. But then I joined this group. It's not in existence anymore. It's called Creditors in Commerce. And it was a very interesting, like I said, it's kind of similar to the Mark Passio work. But they were more working on, they were trying to basically root back down to the common law principles that are underneath our current legal structure and then try to go into court based on common law procedures and kind of go around the upper level legal procedure that most lawyers use, represent themselves in court, and also try to access, this was really kind of crazy, but access credit and funding through alternative methods. And people got into all kinds of weird directions with that. And there was all this mythology that was tied up in it. And I mean, it's the same general movement where you have all of the esoteric kind of patriot stuff that's been going on in America for the longest time, kind of led into this direction. And it's sort of a side branch of just the same movement that Alex Jones is on and Mark Passio's on and all of this, the whole red pill kind of direction. But it was kind of in its own little corner. And I got involved in that. And that's how I got some basic understanding of legal procedures and all of that. And I just sort of found that I was just a natural at understanding the philosophy of law. And I just found that when I was in this group and there's everybody studying law and reading judges' opinions and all of that, and I'm looking at this stuff and I'm like, well, I understand this perfectly. And everybody's like scratching their head. Well, I don't understand. Well, I was naturally had that. And, but I'm so much of an outsider artist type. I'm not interested in getting a law degree and going into the matrix, doing all that. So, but anyway, I started using those skills in that group and coaching people and all of this. And then somebody introduced me to this one individual who's a good friend of mine now. And he was flipping houses. He was buying houses and flipping them in San Diego, in the 2000s when everything was on the upswing. And he had, I think, 2 or 3 houses in foreclosure. And so he contacted me and said, well, hey, it sounds like, because he was listening to our conference calls or whatever, it sounds like you might be able to help me with this. Hiring you is a lot cheaper than hiring a lawyer. So, maybe you can help me, figure out these projects. And so I did. I started getting in there, and then I started to have to figure out the whole securitization angle. And just through synchronicity or whatever, I came in touch with a guy who was a Wall Street, what they call warehouse lender. And he was an expert on securitization. And I would just call him on the phone, and he was a genius and he was a little bit autistic, and he would just ramble and he would just go off. And I would just record the phone calls and I would just ask him all the questions that I had. And then he would just tell me everything that he knew, and I would record the call. And then to learn that information, I would go to the coffee shop with the recordings, and then I would transcribe the recordings. And that's how I learned kind of a lot of the stuff about mortgage securitization. Then, we never fully stopped a foreclosure and made a judge, give a house to somebody or anything like that. But we were able, through our own type of litigation, we were able to keep people in their houses for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. In fact, my friend, the guy that got me, I got into this with, he held on to his property without making a payment for 10 years. So it was, it wasn't a full remedy or anything, but it was a way. We learned ways of beating the banks back and sort of, going in and out of court and stuff. We learned ways so that people could stay in their houses for a lot longer, and save their money, and then sort of use their money to create a plan. And that's kind of, some people I think were kind of, some people were kind of had more of I say they're parasiting on people, and they would tell them that, oh yeah, we can keep you in your house and we can do this and we can do that, which was just BS. Once I kind of got deep enough into it, I realized, no, can't keep you in your house. If you can't, pay your loan back and you can't reach an agreement with the bank, you're going to get foreclosed on. But we can, we can keep you in there long enough for a few years, and so that you can create a plan and all of that. And we can do it very inexpensively and legally. Everything's totally legal, what we were doing. I never messed around with anything that was sketchy. But yeah, so then I did that for a while and learned a whole lot about how the commercial side of the matrix works, and learned a whole lot about how groups can create their own mythologies and project utopia and engage in all kinds of mass projection and fool themselves into getting into trouble and being stupid. And how that you have to be very careful when you get involved in any kind of a group or a movement, because there's a lot of mythology going on in there, a lot of projection going on in there. And so then I got out of that. And then when I think I was about 35, I had a kind of a dark night of the soul, crash of a relationship, and just like a crash of my band and a number of things all at once. And my friend had given me a Jungian book by Robert Johnson called Owning Your Own Shadow. And it had been sitting in the bookshelf, and I pulled that thing out and I read it, and I was like, okay, yeah. All right, this is what I got to do, because I got to figure out, when you have a crash, that's when you are at your, I could give you a kind of a Jungian, sort of in the meantime, I sort of became a Jungian, and you can have this is in the Jungian definition, you are, your ego, your conscious self is out of alignment with your big S self, the Jungians say, your sort of highest purpose and your divine spark, let's say. And you're in a state of depression, you're in a state of darkness, and you're in a state where you're in alchemy, it's the negrito, and where all this unconscious contents are flooding up into your ego and inundating you, and you're drowning in that. And so it's not a good place to be. But if you understand the basic alchemical formula, you realize that is the best place to actually be able to reconfigure your way of being and to actually make real changes that will actually stick. Because normally we're so stuck in our patterning and our normative behavior that it takes a crash, it takes a dark night of the soul for us to get broken down. And you have to have this kind of ego death for you to be able to say, okay, all right, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how I work. I don't know how the world works, and I don't know how this happened to me. And now I have to figure myself out. And it's like you have to be in that state of ultimate humility and hurt before you will actually really make a change. And so for me, that's when I started to get into Jungian psychology and do a lot. I was always introspective, always. I was always self-analytical, but it was at that point where I really started to focus myself inwardly rather than legal procedures or, red pill research or playing music or recording music and all this exoteric stuff. I really turned it around and I said, okay, I'm going to have to really start working on myself internally if I'm going to be able to move past all these destructive patterns, because you don't even really realize how many destructive patterns you have until they really come to the fore. And then you're like, okay, I got to do something. So that kind of started my inner psychological path. And I talk about, I actually have a video and I'm writing a new book and I talk about how that there's I call it 2 paths for the red-pilled initiate, where you have the exoteric culture warrior, and then you have the esoteric or inward focused spiritual alchemist or shaman, or however you want to put it, inner magician. And so that was when that phase started, and I'm still on that now. And then, you go back and forth. You have to be in the world, and then, but also to be healthy and to be, you always want to be open to continual renewal. So, and so that means you have to constantly be kind of upkeeping and doing maintenance on your inner state. And of course, no one gets over their complexes. No one gets over their destructive patterning, just with some workshop or reading a book or some meditation exercise. This is an ongoing thing you're doing always. So once you get turned on to the inner path, then it just becomes part of life. It's like any kind of a, exercise program or health way of life. It's just a way of life. And so that's where I am now. But I have this kind of magician mind, so I'm always trying to kind of figure out stuff, and probably actually in some ways, a lot of this stuff, this inner stuff, you can't figure out with the logical mind. And so there's
maybe not all by itself, right?
There's a limit to that.
You just reminded me, this thought's been in my head a lot. And I don't even know if this quote has a direct quoter, but you can't fill a cup that's already full, and there's what you're talking about, that time of discovery in our life when we kind of have to bump up against some kind of rock bottom, some kind of pain, something that forces us to basically empty our cup and our preconceptions and shave away all the things we built up in our belief systems to observe what actually is. And then once we do that, it's not like done, problem solved, got it figured out. This is a mystery within mysteries, where every door you open leads to a room full of new doors. And so I think it falls upon us, those who are truth seekers, who care about law, like you said, who are interested in the why of things. We have to keep searching and keep kind of renewing ourselves, and keep opening that door and keep pouring that cup out in order so that we can take in more. And that I really got inspired by that aspect of what you were talking about. And so I just want to interject. But get into a little bit into what came out of all that realization, and how the Shadow Tech Alchemy built.
Well, what came out of that realization was, okay, I got a lot of work to do on myself, self-esteem issues. I was always kind of living through the outsider archetype. It's kind of the dark side of the shaman, the dark side of the magician, the scientist, the one who sort of sits on the outside and kind of watches the world and doesn't really get involved in the world. There's the light side to that, is that you have objectivity and perspective on things that most people don't. But the dark side of that is that you never get involved in the world, and that you don't get to participate in the hero's journey if you're just of life, if you're just sort of sitting on the outside. And I sort of found out that I had this kind of that kind of outsider archetype is running, and where is the healthy side of that, and where's the unhealthy side of that? I found out how in my relationships with women, how I was projecting, and like the relationship that I was in at the time I had that one crash, I learned out later there was a lot of what we call anima projection, and in the Jungian language. And so there was anima projection. I also, there's mother complex stuff that gets projected. I project your own mother. It's just kind of common. Women project daddy onto their men, and men project mommy onto their women. Not completely, but that projection is always mixed in with their relationship. And then early relationships, people project their perfect image of their mate, their archetypal perfect woman or perfect man that they have within them. They project that onto the other person. So in the beginning of a relationship, you're always seeing this beautiful perfect image in your mate, which is, some of that's real, and a lot of that is projection. A lot of that is fake. It's a facsimile. It's a projection. And so, this is pretty common. You get into a relationship with somebody, you have that initial boost because you're projecting perfection onto the other, and then that starts to give way, and all then the mommy and daddy side starts to come in, and all the negative patterns that you inherited from your parents, all the types of fights and conflicts that they used to have, you find that you have with your mate, and those conflicts, you find out how that they're tied to aspects of yourself which are habitual. And so you can't stop yourself, and they can't stop themselves, and you get yourself embroiled into different kinds of conflicts. Different people have different kinds of conflicts. There's all kinds of types of conflicts. And so you find yourself, sucked into those kinds of things. And you can't talk your way out of it, and you can't blame the other person because you're part of the circuit also. And so then do you run away, or what do you do? Or do you just kind of shut yourself down and stay in the relationship? All this kind of stuff, this is all, how you are, the ways in which you get into conflicts or do self-destructive things when you're with others, when you're with friends, when you're in the workplace, your whole relational profile and how it's dysfunctional. And when you start being honest with yourself and you start saying, okay, I'm going to turn over these rocks, just like how the red pill researcher is pulling up all these threads, turning over all these rocks and going, oh, what's under here? Look at this corruption here. Look at how this works. And look how the Freemasons were doing this, or look how such and such group is doing that, or George Soros, or whatever it is, or how wherever your research is going, or 9/11, and look how they, put the bombs in the buildings, or whatever it is you're researching. You're uncovering all this dark stuff, all these threads of evil, so to speak. Well, that exact same procedure, you got to do that to yourself, right? So it's especially if you have the inclination to look at all those dark things, well, then you may have the talent and the inclination to look at those things in yourself. And so that's kind of how it turned out with me, is I just turned around my research into the dark side of the culture, and I just turned it around into research into the dark side of the psyche, starting with me, because that's all I really know is me. There's nothing in the world that isn't me, really, that I can prove. So I really got to start with me. I'm the common denominator in everything. And so then that just sort of became a quest to understand what Jung called the shadow. And we can talk about that and everything. But so that kind of just got me onto that. And I realized, oh, okay, well, there's, I started to research this. Like I said, I started reading Robert Johnson's books and looking at other Jungians talking about, the dark side of oneself. And I found out, okay, this is a whole category called the shadow of the psyche, and it's in alchemy, it's in psychology. And I started researching, and I realized pretty early on that this is a completely under-investigated subject, in the same way that all the red pill stuff is an under-investigated subject, or was 15 years ago in the world, in the external world. This is an under-investigated subject in psychology, and you start trying to get answers for all your questions of how am I pathological? How is my destructive behavior work? What is behind these things? How does trauma, how does it work, and what does it do to people, and how is it passed on intergenerationally? And you start looking around for answers, and you go, oh, hardly anyone's really been looking at this. Everybody's been looking at all this external stuff, and everybody's been neglecting this difficult inner shadow work. And I realized, well, and it's kind of up my alley, and so I just started putting my mind to it. And in the same way that I put my mind to the mortgage-backed securities and figured out how all this foreclosure stuff was working, I just did that with the psychology, and it's a lot more difficult. It's a lot more difficult.
Yeah, what a tricky path you chose.
Yeah, so now I'm like this, I'm in this field, and I have some experience. Some experience, enough to where I can talk about it, enough to where I can, tell you some shadow work practices that I know work and stuff. But no one's an expert in this. There isn't anyone.
Yeah, so, we all should be experts as to the best of our capability. From my point of view, one thing that I'd say recently over the last few months, I think morality is reality. I think this reality we're experiencing is largely God experiencing itself. Now, that God is a charged word, and I got to be careful who I say it around, just like evil. And, some of my early presentations and even my recent ones, I'm real careful in the beginning to explain what I mean by these words, because, for instance, I grew up in Christianity, going to church every Sunday. My dad was a preacher. He became somewhat of a theologian. He actually went and did extended studies to get his Master's of Divinity. And, or I think that's the term for the, anyway,
I think so.
We had books all over the house. He studied, even studied in different languages when he could. He was, he loved this stuff. And so, that passed on to me, the curiosity and the joy of learning and comparing. And it's one thing to have philosophies and all, but the troubling thing I found, that especially with Christianity for me, is that you get to a point in any religion where you're bound to stories and storylines. And that's where the major argument and people butting of heads really gets ridiculous from my point of view. Sorry if anyone takes offense, that's your own shadow work, because, it doesn't make sense to base our decisions off of things we don't know when there are things that we do know that we can make our decisions off of. So what I'd like to do with you here, for the sake of the rest of our conversation, is kind of go back and forth a little bit about how we define evil, this being the End Evil podcast. I find that the way most average person I might talk to is sort of befuddled by the fact that my podcast is called End Evil, because they say, oh, evil can't be ended. What do you mean? So I thought I'd throw that out there and kind of get your take on it.
Yeah, let's start with that. Okay, so because a number of ways I could approach this, but I'd say probably most evil, as most people would probably define it just off the top of their head, is probably some kind of behavior where one or more people engage in some kind of behavior that's unnecessarily destructive to one or more other people. And we would say, because, most cultures would agree that there's instances where you can destroy another person in one way or another that is not immoral, and we don't call that evil. You can defend yourself in a fight, or you can even defend your nation in war. There are exemptions to this, but usually evil is defined as some conscious, unnecessary destruction of another person or another group of people. And then we kind of extend it down to maybe to other life forms, to animals. Modern, postmodern people extend that down to animals and other life forms. People are now, environmentalists and stuff would even say, to destroy the planet or destroy living organisms on the planet, ecosystems, that's evil. So it has to do with destroying other life forms, either intentionally or unnecessarily. Is that how you would sort of define it, or what would you say to that?
Oh man, that's coming super close. Like right in the beginning of the show, I always say evil is the destruction of freedom. And because to me,
Yeah.
the gift we've been given to make decisions, to have choices in this life, is pretty unique in this world that we've experienced with other animals and plants and minerals. They don't have the same level of choice that we do. We have this extra level of freedom of choice where we can manipulate things and create technologies to change things. And so that opens a lot of door for, like you're saying, various levels of destruction. And I think it's really key that you brought up the conscious decision, because I think that's, to me, the confusion that I like to dispel right off. Like a volcano blowing up and a whole town of people dying. It's not evil.
That's not evil.
Not by the description I'm giving it. That's an act of nature. It's something that happens. I don't see nature as evil, and I also don't see human nature as necessarily being evil.
Right.
It's the choices people make, and the reason this word's important is because it provides a bridge for us to have this discussion on what are the things in life that we're doing that we shouldn't be doing, or what are the things in life that humans are doing that we could be doing different, because it applies directly to humans. So, like, I'm not really talking about, what's going on another realm of universe or beings that we don't know. I'm talking about us humans. And so, like, I have the yin yang actually tattooed, right here. And I think of that yin yang, the dark and the white, symbolizing like kind of like the hermetic balance of reality, that there's always light and dark, there's cold and light, but they're all part of the same spectrum. But oftentimes I find that people I'm talking to are kind of like seeing that as meaning black and white, or light and dark are good and evil, and that they're always going to be struggling, and one's always going to be there and the other one's always going to be there. And I'm like, yeah, in a universal, from God's point of view, or from, we're looking at this whole situation from way out objectively. Yeah. But when we're inside of these human bodies, what that word actually means to me is like literally stealing something. You're taking something that wasn't ever your freedom to take. And that's what, taxation is, for instance, because it's literally stealing something that wasn't ever yours, making claim on somebody else's body, somebody else's property, and saying it belongs to you now because you're the president, or, I'm wearing this blue hat, therefore I'm the authority over you. I can force you into my car, or, any number of all these little differences that we're going to have with the everyday culture as it is, that's constantly doing these things and calling them okay. Even what I think you brought up is, to me, a tricky walking the line one, where it's self-defense when you're defending yourself, defending your family. But now if someone else creates a belief system, like so many religions have done, that, we need to go kill all those people because they don't believe in God or whatever. Now it's getting really warped, and we're basing these decisions on beliefs. It's not just self-defense. It's not just protecting what's ours and the freedom that we should have by virtue of being alive. Does that make sense? Or am I going the weeds?
No, you completely make sense. And what you did there, to my mind, is that you actually sort of followed sort of the natural progression of assumptions or ideas that come from this analysis of evil and how it's defined, and then kind of where does it go from there. And so it's very important that we do actually go back and define things, and then kind of take these steps carefully. But I took a few notes while you were talking there, going back to the beginning. When we talk about evil, we are talking, and anybody that's into this should read the first chapter of our book, Shadow Tech, which is on our website, shadowtechalchemy.com. The first chapter of the book, it's called The Zero and the One. And I actually took you through sort of the metaphysical yin-yang understanding of duality. And sort of the very first sort of I think I called it the fundamental meta program of this a simulation we're in, this reality. And that so that you when at the most fundamental level, we're just talking about activity, passivity, dark, light, in, out, up, down, all of that. And then as we start to move into the realm of human beings, human behavior, society, and all that, then we start to take this dualistic model and we apply it naturally to what's good and what's bad from a moral or social standpoint. And so that's where we get evil, good, and evil. So it's an extrapolation just of basic duality, because we're in this duality universe. We're actually, I don't think the universe is a dual natured program. I think that is a dimension, and part of our mind and body is set to pick up on that dimension. I don't even think that's the universe itself is stuck in that binary kind of program. I think that's just one, as part of the simulation we're in, if you want to call it that. But when we talk about evil, we're talking about the yin yang when it starts to get into creation and destruction within the field of human society and the field and that's where you get morality from. It's the rules that society puts in place to govern human interactions. And so when we're talking about evil, we're talking about human behavior or intentions which become behavior. And then you go, okay, so if we recognize that, if we define evil, perhaps something like what I did, whereas it's unnecessary destruction brought by one or more persons onto one or more other persons, something like that, or other life forms, then we start to go, okay, well, that phrase, one man's good is another man's evil. And then you start to get into the conundrum of the fact that when you start going through whatever list you want to make of destructive things that you could do, evil things, you could say, okay, well, I'll take the Judeo-Christian 10 Commandments. Let's take that, or whatever, right? Or the 7 deadly sins or whatever. Let's use that as the list, or whatever list that you want to come up with. The fact is that you start talking to people, especially when you start getting into other cultures, and you start comparing your list of evils with their list of evils, you find not everybody agrees on that list. And you find that different cultures have different moral value sets. And then you run into this problem of having to reckon with the fact that there's a subjective nature to evil. And I discussed that in that chapter, and what do you do about it? And it's sort of people talk about this now as sort of a postmodern recognition of the subjectivity of reality, and how that can be helpful, and that can also be dangerous and put you into this, what they call moral relativism. But a way to kind of clear this up, and when you start to take the concept of destruction and you bring it into the human domain, the human social domain, you start calling it evil, and you start coming up with lists of here's all the things that are evil and here's the things that are good and stuff. You can do that. And if you have people with a common language, with a common religious background, common environment, common upbringings, and all of that, you can find that people can generally agree on what's good and what's evil, or at least on what's evil. And then they can agree to live by those moral codes. You can do that. But when you have the current, when you start having people like the Crusaders, like the Christians, coming to South America or North America and finding these indigenous people and comparing their behavior and lists and moral, value sets with theirs, then you run into a real big problem, because you find out that people have different, and so that's where people would come into, what's going on with the natural law thing, is they would say, well, maybe we could dig back further and let's find some principles, let's find some moral codes that are more objective and that everyone could agree on. And I think that's a very useful practice and thing to do. But
being able to define it, one thing I'd like to add is one that I've discovered, and I'm starting to adjust my terminology, is because I kept noticing that there's always a confusion between ethics and morals. And so, I've looked up these words several times, even, on multiple dictionaries. Yep. And what I find, my interpretation is that ethics is a code, like you're saying, of sort of rules that people create based on, maybe where they live or how they live, right? But ethics are based on morality. And morality, as the way I like to define it, doesn't really change from place to place. There should be a commonality if indeed, we're all living in the same reality. Stealing is just as wrong one place or another. Raping of children is just the same wrong as it is here as it is somewhere else. Now, there are certain things this is part of why it gets tricky, because in school they teach cultural relativism, and it's sort of a workaround for objective reality. And we know some of the people that write textbooks, they're happy if everyone doesn't think that there is a such thing as reality, and that we can all have our own realities. And
because social engineers can then use that as a rationale to brainwash
battling
people.
that school textbook thing they do of basically telling people that, we can all have our own version of morality, where I kind of try to bring it back to that morality is something that we should all be able to discover. It should be real with or without our interpretation of it. But our interpretation of it would be what the code of our ethics would be, our ethical codes. But I mean, that's just the way I
ethics is kind of more of the secular side of morality, or you could say it's sort of an offshoot of morality, and that morality is generally carried through a civilization's religious and spiritual culture. And then the ethics, for example, if you have a corporation and, you have rules within the corporation, they would call that ethics. And it would be rooted in the civilization's moral codes that come down through their religious code usually. But the religious code, that's always attributed to deities, to gods, to saints and avatars of different kinds. When you're saying, okay, well, let's find what the most base moral codes that everybody agrees on, I think probably a good chunk of what you're finding that's at the base of morality is in all mammals. And you start looking at the way gorillas are socially, and a lot of the same stuff that animals accept or don't accept about each other, the way chimpanzees and baboons, gorillas, the way what they will accept as appropriate behavior and what they won't accept as appropriate behavior is pretty similar to a lot of what we will accept or not accept. And so you start to realize that our morality is built into our biology. And it's basically just over, wherever you are with your idea of evolution and all that, but over the course of time, organisms work out what kinds of behaviors further the group, and at the detriment of the individual, and what kind of behaviors further the individual at the detriment of the group, and try to find some kind of code for how to balance those things. I mean, amoebas are doing this. So there is basic behavioral codes of behavior that we call morality, which is just built into biological life forms. And then as these life forms get more and more developed, and as their social behavior gets more and more nuanced and developed, and as they begin able to travel to different environments and all of that over long periods of time, you start to, you build slowly a value system of morality that keeps society operating, right? And so that's pretty basic. It's pretty understandable. And this is why, people will agree that, from this tribe to this tribe, this civilization to this civilization. But then you will find, after you got through that basic kind of human morality that's shared amongst all humans, then from that point forward, then you're going to get into all these nuances. You got some tribes out there that, say under certain circumstances, it's okay to, kill and eat other members of the tribe, right? I mean, cannibalism is acceptable in certain conditions at certain times and within certain, ritual, situations, or this kind of behavior, this is proper defensive behavior. Some cultures will say, somebody cheats on your wife or whatever, you have a right to divorce the woman, or you have a right to do this or that, or get adjudication through the community. Another culture says, no, you have a right to go over to his house, put a gun to his head and shoot him. Different people, different tribes, different societies are going to have a wide degree of variance of what they would consider to be right and wrong, or what their moral codes are. And that's where we're running into the biggest problem, especially now as these populations become so intermixed, and we have all these different variations of cultural codes. Then that's kind of part of the reason why I think a lot of people are going back to the drawing board and going, okay, well, this is getting really confusing. There's a lot of different people with a lot of different beliefs. And then plus you have all these psychopaths that are trying to brainwash people, and they're trying to tell people that there is no such thing as morality. And you just kind of invent your own moral code, which you can't do, because the most basic morality is written into your genetics, and you will revert back to it, even if you're brainwashed by a communist cult. And then you get out of that cult, once, you will revert back to your basic biological morality. So it's more of the fine tuning and the nuance of this is kind of where we're running into problems. And then also the last quick thing I'll say on that is that as far as moral relativism goes, and Jordan Peterson has actually pointed this out, and I think in a correct way, and that is that the postmodernists, if you take the sort of the dark side of postmodernism away and just go to its kind of philosophical base, as sort of a French philosophy from the 50s, 60s, or whatever it was. Maybe that's the sort of the peak of it or whatever. But that understanding that morality, ethics, cultural values, all the built-in kind of implications that are behind culture are relative and flexible, subjective. That is actually, in a sense, true. And that's just provable because you can go to different cultures and you can say, hey, over here in India, how are you operating? And what do you think and believe? And, oh, well, it's working for you, but you have a different belief. Oh, okay, over here, what do you think and believe? Oh, well, it's working for you and you have a different belief. You would kind of conclude from that that these things are relative. But relative doesn't mean, okay, I could go, hey, you're running a, Macintosh operating system over there, that's built on Linux or whatever. And you're over here running Windows and it's built on DOS operating system or whatever. And you have this app and it works on your computer. Let me just take this app from your computer and run it on my computer. It won't work. They're not just cross-compatible like that. So even though there is a that cultural values are relatively relative, that they're relative from person to person, tribe to tribe, culture to culture, whatever it is, doesn't mean that you can just swap things in and you can just start putting your own stuff that you didn't even really think through very good and just start popping it in there and saying, I'm going to create the perfect society with my new set of ethics that I'm going to brainwash people into believing. And I'm just going to stand this new culture up and just let it run. It's not going to run because this stuff is built into our genetics. So just because there is a relative aspect to morality and even a relative aspect to all perception at all, doesn't mean that you're going to be able to make it work in practice. And that's where I would say to these postmoderns in these universities, they're trying to teach these people, all this stuff and what the capitalists wrote and what Adam Smith wrote and John Locke wrote and the founding fathers. That's just all, relative, and we don't have to run things that way. Okay, show me. Start your own commune, start your own micro community in upstate New York or whatever, put into place your principles, run that community, and let's see how you do. But they don't want to do that. They never want to practice and prove their work. They want to take their ideas and just throw them from the top-down position, brainwash people into believing them, and then just think that they're just going to throw their, beta test their system on everyone. And then you look around at all the other places where communism or whatever form of collectivism was tried, and you go, oh man, those were catastrophes. And you realize, okay, there's something more than this. They're not actually interested in running they're using this ideology that they're proposing as that there's something that there is, when we call it a cult, this is malware. This is malware. And these people are infected with malware, and they have the impulse to then feed that malware, to transmit that malware to everybody else. This is a situation of cultural malware, cultural parasitism. And then I would propose that it's sourced in the unconscious minds, in the pathology of the psyches of the professors, of the university heads and the people whoever are pushing this stuff, of the politicians. And so you realize they're not really serious about having a better society and all of that. They're overtaken in the same way that fundamentalist Christians, the Puritans, will run over to some other group and say, "Oh, you don't believe what we believe? Oh, well, we're going to have to chop your head off in Jesus' name." That's insane. That's not what Jesus taught. So they're obviously taken over by something. They're possessed. So what we're talking about with a lot of this push of postmodernism and cultural relativism and wokeism and all of that is we're talking about possession. We're talking about spirit possession. We're talking about cultural malware. We're talking about the collective shadow, as Carl Jung talked about it. That's where I take the whole thing. So when you look into the dark side of all of this, and you want to get down to the basics and say, how do we clean all this up? Because there's all these confused people pushing all this garbage that's obviously trash. What's going on here? Maybe we need to, figure out what our morality is and reimpose our morality. I say everybody knows what all the good morality is. It's in our biology. It's obvious. What's happening is people are sick with cultural pathogens. People are possessed by cultural pathogens, which can only take hold in people who are psychologically sick.
Yeah, which kind of brings it back to, like we talked about before, the cup is already full. It can't take another drop. And I've, had these discussions with folks over the years. I'm just one of those people that, if there's an opportunity to talk about psychology or spirituality or religion, I'm there, I'm in this conversation. Right.
Yeah.
And I could tell, before we even talked, that there might be some nuances in how we use some of those words, but you're someone who's going to be able to explore these topics and ideas, and we're going to be able to find where this common ground is and have this discussion. And that's the discussion I don't think happens very often in the public domain. It's sidelined in the educational system and obscured with other things that they're trying to put in front of you as being more important, when, what could be more important than understanding where our choices come from, why we make the choices we make, and why we're actually here, and what's the point of our life. And ultimately, I want to next transition into what we call the shadow work and the inner self, because to me, one of the most wisest things I ever heard on this was coming from Thomas Paine. And he was pointing out the nature of a revelation. He was not saying all good things about the Bible, but he was pointing out a revelation in its basic definition would be, the relationship between the person and the divine, when you realize this divine realization, right? And revelation or realization, it comes to the same thing. I realize something like, oh my gosh, it doesn't matter how hard it hits to me and how big of a deal it is to me. It's my realization. When I try to explain it to you, for you, it's an idea or a thought that Chris is explaining. It's not the revelation, the realization itself. That it comes from the source, and I call it my divine crystal, our consciousness.
I would call it gnosis. That's your gnosis,
right?
That's
like your conduit to the great all. The great everything. Right? There is more going on here than just the logical progression. And if someone wants to just kind of throw all that out and say, I don't believe in any of that, then they have yet to experience this aspect of reality that we know is real, because we're experiencing it on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. You talked with Leslie and Derek a little bit about synchronicity. That's one of the ways I see it happen. And then early in this conversation, you said something about, the intellect can only go so far, or logically, we can only go so far in these things. There's a point at which, whether it requires us to be intuitive, to touch into this other part of our being that's not just logical, that's not just based on the facts, that understands that there's something more going on here. And I guess what I'm getting at is that there's definitely reality to things that aren't material, and the non-material world, everything in the material world in some way or another comes from that world. So this work of learning to understand our shadow and see our shadow and look within is where the key to unlock this whole kingdom of a better world exists, and it's not emphasized enough. So
it's the world of psyche.
Yeah, let's talk about the shadow, because I'm not as knowledgeable as I'd like to about Jung. And, I've touched on him over time. And like I said, my dad brought up a lot of this stuff.
You'd like Jung because he's sort of it's kind of like a mixture of, it's like esoteric Christianity and shamanism.
Sounds
so
good.
if you're coming from that Western Christian kind of ecosystem, but it was too tight of a cage, and it wasn't answering all the questions, and it was, then Jung breaks you out of that, and he brings you right into spirituality, but in the esoteric side, the Western side rather than the Eastern side, because a lot of people break out of Christianity and they go over to the East and they study Taoism, Buddhism, of whatever flavor. And then they get the kind of spiritual, operating system, that they're not getting in their Christianity. Jung is an alternative for people who don't really feel that they feel that they're spiritual people, that they feel like they're like what you're talking about. They feel like they have to align with their divine spark. You could say, the Gnostics would say, and that they don't that they always have to align themselves with their heart, with God, so to speak, but they don't really like the Christian way of putting it. It's too old school, it's too simplistic for them or whatever. Jung is a way of kind of keeping the best of that and then also going off into whole new directions. But the shadow, our understand, our psychology is not even that old. It's like if you go back into the 1800s and you start, it gets very kind of, it gets a lot more medieval and you would say primitive, maybe, from the current understanding of psychology. The way people think about psychology is maybe, the mind, the way it works and all that and what it is. And it is 130, 140, 150 years old or something like that. And the idea of the shadow started with Freud's, I'd say, they say Freud is the father of modern psychology. Freud's idea that not everything in the mind is accessible by your will. Not everything is, I can't just remember all memories and I can't access, the only time dreams are not something that comes to me on my own willpower. There's something that's shown to me in a way and in a frequency that I have no control over. Things can just show up out of the unconscious. Information can just show up to you. People can have visual and auditory hallucinations. People can actually, people that, can have all kinds of conditions where they have all kinds of psychic splitting going on and multiple personalities, and people, started recognizing, okay, wait, what we have access to in consciousness is not all there is in consciousness, that there's a whole other domain that's in the shadow. And that just became the unconscious. And so now the most basic kind of formulation of the human mind is that you have a conscious part, the part that you can recall, the part that you wake up to every morning and you go, oh yeah, I have the same memories. I remember it's the same family. I grew up. Yeah, it's a continuous waking state of awareness that's solid and worldview and self-image. And you have that solid awareness, and that's your ego in the Western sense. In the Eastern philosophies, they kind of look at it in a little bit different way. But in the Western psychology, that's the ego. It's ego consciousness, ego awareness. And this is a part of the total psyche. And then everything that's not in the ego that I can't just recall or I can't summon, but I know it's in my mind, that's the unconscious. And then they used to use, the early psychologists often use this idea that there was it's like, imagine like an iceberg where the tip of the iceberg is above the water. That's your ego awareness. That's me. That's I. And and then below the surface of the water, that's everything that's in the unconscious. And the majority of the mind is unconscious. And now some people suspect it's like 5% conscious, 95% unconscious. So that's kind of a basic model of the human psyche. And then what is the psyche? Well, it's kind of, we could use it's not accurate really, but it's a helpful analogy is that it's like the operating system. It's like the software of the body. And so the shadow was a development that came from the Freudian understanding of the unconscious, which was originally like everything was in the shadow, was in the unconscious. But then Jung developed this concept where you have the unconscious, and then in the unconscious, you have even deeper, darker material than just basic unconscious material. You have shadow material in there. And that's the stuff that is being what they call repressed. That's the stuff that the conscious ego just cannot tolerate. And so most of your unconscious material doesn't even need to make it into consciousness. You don't need to remember all those old memories. There's all kinds of conclusions that were made and emotional states that were activated 20 years ago. They're still remembered in the unconscious. You don't need to have access to all of that. We can't even handle that. We don't have the processing power for all of that. But then there's this category of the shadow, and this is the stuff that's trying to come up. It's trying to get into consciousness. It would be very helpful for your self-image, and it would be very helpful for your development, for your sanity, for your, what the Jungians call your sense of wholeness, if you could find and assimilate this shadow material. But it's being repressed because it's too dangerous. So what happens is the ego mind holds it down. It denies it. It holds it in cognitive dissonance. And what's in the shadow is different from person to person, but then a lot of similar stuff, just like how the morality is shared to a great degree from culture to culture, our shadow material is shared from culture to culture. So a lot of what, let's just take our culture where you have all the sins and, the basic sins. Well, those sins, those were codified to give people direction that if you don't behave in this way, you'll have basically a symbiotic culture. So great. That's great. Don't murder, don't kill, don't cheat, don't steal, these things, right? Don't be jealous, don't have envy, these kinds of things. And you'll have a relatively stable society. Well, that's true. But why would you need to have rules to stop people from acting on certain impulses if those impulses didn't exist? Those impulses do exist. So now that you have a moral code that says what's right and wrong, what do you do with the drives, with the biological, instinctual drives that would have you steal something, that would have you cheat on your wife or husband, that would have you be jealous and envious and covetous and all of that? Those are biological drives. So where does that energy go? That's what gets held back in the shadow. And then if you actually had a bad childhood, or if you were teased or bullied or whatever, and you have kind of leftover rage from that, but that's not, you can't just have a temper tantrum in the workplace. Whatever it is that you have in your personal closet, so to speak, whatever skeletons are in your personal closet, you shove that down in the shadow. So your shadow is a collection of biological drives that are destructive to society, and then personal wounds and personal faults and weaknesses that would be destructive to your relationships. People would think differently about you if you let all this stuff out. You might lose relationships. You might lose your qualifications in such and such job or whatever, or be ousted if you were a politician or whatever. So you got to shove this stuff down. And the thing is, you don't even know you're doing it. It's an unconscious, automatic repression is an automatic thing that just shoves this.
It's like self-defense, right? Like
it's a self-defense mechanism.
We do it to protect ourselves in various ways, correct?
Yeah.
It's not like the ego is out to, make it harder on ourselves, even though in that process that happens, the ego is trying to protect, right? I had a good friend who brought up that the ego is kind of like our protector dog. It wants to keep ourselves safe, and it wants to protect the perimeter, basically, right?
Yeah, I would say that the ego is just your consciousness, but that you have these defense mechanisms in your ego to protect it. You have dogs.
It's not a bad thing. It's
security guards.
Ego is so oftenly thought of as an evil thing, but it's not. And we had a couple good talks about that on weeks past, and that's kind of why I went down.
Yeah, that's coming from the Eastern philosophers when they talk about ego, dissolving the ego, and we could go in that direction. But in the Western psychological sense, the ego is just your consciousness, your awake, aware consciousness. Mm-hmm. And so
I think people just get it confused because so often it's like, oh, that guy has a big ego, he can't listen to anything, and they think of that means a negative character trait. More often than not, where that's not really what even you're describing. It's not a necessarily negative thing at all. It's
I would call that's an ego function. That would be grandiosity or hubris, inflation.
An abuse of the ego
they call it inflation in Jungian psychology. They call it grandiosity and inflation, where and it's not your whole ego, but it's an aspect where you're getting a lot of energy, you're getting a lot of fuel. And you're getting a lot of feedback from other people that are saying, hey, you're so great in this area. You're so good at this. And they're like, yeah, I am good at this. Wow. You could be our leader. Yeah, I could be a leader, and then you start to get inflated. Now that you won't have that inflation in every place at every time, you'll go home and then, your wife will be cooking dinner or whatever. And, and she says, can you take care of the potatoes or whatever? And you burn the potatoes and you recognize, I suck at cooking anyway, so you won't have inflation in all areas at all times, but there will be these channels of genius of where you actually are good, and then you'll get inflated in that place, and that is actually that's eventually what leads to a fall anyway. But so that's the idea of the shadow. The shadow is it's your faults, it's your weaknesses, it's everything that you don't want to think is a part of you, and it's all your darkness. It's all the stuff. And it's kind of subjective from person to person and culture to culture, but it is your personal and cultural darkness that's part of your makeup, and everyone has it. But in order to have organized societies, we have to repress this stuff and, be on our and put our we have to repress those destructive drives that we have. Otherwise, we destroy society. And so it's a problem. It's a fundamental problem that we all have. And repression is actually just the first step of how what we do with our shadow material. The first thing we do is just repress it. That's just get it out of the way. Don't let it come up. And literally, if it were to constantly be leaking up, you'd be going over in your head. And this is a pathology of I suck at this. I suck at that. I'm probably going to fail at this. I'm probably going to fail at that. They think I'm ugly. They're not going to like me. Blah, 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 and all of that. So your ego has to push that stuff down. So the other thing that we do, the next thing that we do is, besides repression, is we project. And this is where you get shadow projection. And this is what you see going on in politics. And when you were talking about evil earlier, and you talk about atrocities and how that, people can get sucked into these mass psychoses, and then they can just, can have genocides and stuff. These are called mass projections. There's a guy named Matthias Desmet now. He calls it mass formation. And then Robert Malone put psychosis on it, and he calls it mass formation psychosis. And these are collective projections where people get together in groups. They identify as we're Trump supporters, or we're Hillary supporters, or we're communists, or we're capitalists, or we're this, or we're that, and we're Christians, we're Muslims, whatever. They identify with a group. Their own self-image becomes stuck to the group ideology, to the group worldview, and then they unconsciously project all their own shadow material, which is similar because they're similar. They have a similar personality type. They have a similar background. They have people that get together in groups have similarities. They're affinity groups. And so they have similar shadow material. And then it becomes very convenient for them to pick a scapegoat out in the world to target And then together, they will get together and they will have a mass projection. And through that method, they will displace their own shadow material. And so, everybody that had an asshole dad, right, and couldn't get over it, and of a certain personality type within a certain demographic, hates Trump. And then we can all get together and we can all bash Trump and laugh about Trump and demean Trump and root for him to get thrown in jail. Or we could do it with Obama, or we could do it with Clinton, or whoever it is, right? And we can have this mass collective cathartic, displacive, if that's a word, projection ritual. And then, we can go to protests and we can make little Trump dolls and we can hang him by a noose, and we can burn a Trump effigy or whatever. And we can have this mass projection where we let loose all the leftover feelings from our own screwed up childhoods, that aspect of it, into the world. And we can get a cathartic release through this collective projection. And then we can look around at our friends, and we're all in the protest together, and we're all burning the Trump effigy together and cheering. And then we can also benefit from the fact that we have our friends together, and we have our worldview is the same. Or the Palestinians can do it after 9/11, and they can all cheer that the great Satan is dying and stuff, and they can all that kind of stuff, and burn American flags and all that, or whatever group you want. All humans are doing this. And so that's the other thing, the more dangerous thing. When you repress your shadow material, it leads to your own health problems and your own neuroses. But then when you get together with groups and you have a shared scapegoat, then you dump all that stuff on other people. And through that mechanism, that's how evil is created in the world. That is one, not the only way, but that is one very big way in which actual evil moves through society, is through shadow projection.
Wow, that's a very well described truth that I see and have observed, and I don't think I've put it quite to the words you have. I appreciate the way you're explaining that. Yeah. And I want to kind of send people to check out your website, shadowtechalchemy.com. I have displayed here the page that's the tab under books, where your book resides on that website.
Still get it for free, I think. I give it, if you get on my mailing list, you could get a link pops up and the book comes down for free. You can get it on Kindle as a paperback, or as a Kindle or a paperback. There's a new book coming out, the short one, that I'm going to give that one away for free, and then I'm going to sell Shadow Tech more. But book sales, it's not any kind of source of income or anything, but
it's a beautiful thing that you've done in creating a book and thinking these things out for yourself. And that's
Melissa and I did. Yeah.
Constantly challenging. Yeah. Here's some, if you guys look on the website here, some interviews, Carolyn Riley.
Melissa has her own. Yeah.
Melissa. And then, they recently did, Melissa and Colin did an interview with Dissolving the Divide, my friends, Derek and Leslie. And so, I've been so interested in everything you're saying and the convo and wanting to get involved that I just noticed the time, and I'm kind of starting to run out of time here. So I do want to bring things to a close here.
Yeah.
Kind of point out your website and this resource you've created, the book people can download for free. Yeah. And I'm going to be going through that book myself. And,
Chapter one talks about this, objective versus subjective evil, and kind of how it's linked. The yin yang symbol is even used in there as a model. And then you're going to like what's in there. And so.
Right on. Well, thanks for bringing that to the world. And, I think if everybody had these kind of conversations, or even everybody tried to have these conversations, it would make a huge difference on the level.
Well, that's kind of my mission right now. And I've been a little bit sort of introverted and focusing on being a musician, audio engineer, kind of doing this on the side. We did some interviews back in 2015 when the book went out. We were on Sean Stone's Buzzsaw and did some other ones.
Oh yeah, I remember Sean Stone. Yeah.
Yeah, but then we kind of kicked back and stuff because I realized I didn't want to be too. I wanted to really make sure I knew what the hell I was talking about, and so my kind of mission right now is that I recognize the whole red pill movement, all these, the reason why you don't hear this being talked about so much, aside from inside the Jungian groups and stuff, and they even try to stay away from it, most of them, is because it naturally pushes back on you. Because to even talk about it, you're going, okay, well then that means I got a bunch of crap in my own unconscious I've been avoiding, and oh man, it doesn't feel good when I touch on those memories and blah, blah, blah. Nobody wants to touch on all that stuff. Well, if you just leave a wound alone and let it fester, it's going to turn into gangrene. You're going to get an infection. And so that's what's happening around our whole society. We're so allergic to looking at our own dark side that we're now absolutely infested with all this psychic parasitism. And so what I'm saying is that the red pill group, the red pill movement, whatever truther movement you can call it, in whatever version, these folks, me, you, all of us in this movement, we are already somewhat inoculated to evil. We're looking at evil in the cultural and societal domains, and we have gone through the kind of traumatic initiation to recognize, oh, wait a minute, there's all this darkness all around us. It's everywhere, and we couldn't see it before. So we've already kind of been through this red pill initiation. So we, I think, are already somewhat inoculated. So we're probably the prime demographic that can now start going, okay, well, now let's turn it around. Let's take the same kind of dynamics that we see going on in the world, and let's recognize that as above, so below, that's going on inside of us. And what is the science of studying the dark side of the psyche? Where is that science? What have we already figured out? What is the maps that have already been made? Okay, let's pick those up. Let's start looking at this. What's the terminology and now let's start educating ourselves about this. Then, of course, start doing the shadow work, which we haven't talked about, and then just start bringing this whole field into consciousness, just like how we saw all the corruption and everything slowly come up over the last 20 years. And finally, all this knowledge about all the corruption is finally breaking into the mainstream. Well, the next move, and we're only at the very beginning of it, is to try to recognize how this works inside the human personal and collective psyche, and how that we're all contributing to it, and that we're all part of this shadow deep state circuitry of the psyche, and then start doing the shadow work and putting that flashlight on ourselves. That's how you're going to clean up all the corruption. And there's a lot more we could talk about another time about the nuanced way in which shadow material moves from person to person and how evil is transmitted and all of this. But just that basic realization that all this dark stuff that's happening in the world is also happening in the personal psyche, and that we have to start digging that out and mapping that out. That's where I'm at with folks and what I'm trying to kind of bring to the table.
Yeah. And, the Hermetic, correspondence, this is
law of correspondence.
The law of correspondence is that this, what's happening out there is also happening in here. And so It falls upon us to do this work within ourselves. And I think if we were able to have a follow-up conversation, I really would love to get more into what that actually is. And I do roundtables, usually live roundtables a couple times a month. So maybe we'll even do one on this topic or more than one.
Yeah.
Because it can't come up enough, and it usually does in one form or another. Self-work, because most of the people that show up for my podcast are kind of already on that tip and already getting that. So I
noticed
really
that. Yeah.
appreciate having you here and your knowledge and opening some doors of thought that that are new to some of us. Obviously I have more work to do on studying Jungian psychology, and I'm looking forward to that and looking some more into your book. But let's just end it by maybe just giving folks just like one or two practical day-to-day things we can do to begin shadow work. If someone's confused about where do I start, give someone a couple ideas.
I'll give you two things that you can do that'll get you about a few years down the road, and you won't even have to do anything else for several years. The first thing is just and you can start with some kind of a meditation practice if you want to. That's good. And for a lot of different reasons. But the first thing is just try to, and you already have this, most people that are introspective at all already have this kind of higher function. Like, it's like, okay, I'm talking to you, I'm talking to the mic, I'm looking into the camera, but then my awareness is above that. I know that the body is talking and there's an aware part of me that's watching. Or when you get into an argument with your wife or whatever, your girlfriend, and you are getting taken over by the conflict, but there's a part of you that's aware of it, that's going, oh God, here we go again. Man, I thought we were going to be able to avoid this. There's a higher part that's the watcher part of you. And so you basically want to keep training that. You already got it going. Most people already have it going. So just kind of keep training that. And then as you're going through life and you're making decisions, or you're getting intuitions about go this way or go that way or this or that, you just kind of keep that higher functioning watcher and you just watch yourself. And then when you find yourself going in a direction that turns out to be, oh, that wasn't the right move, or I ended up hurting that person's feelings, or I ended up having an emotional outburst while I was driving on the road, or whatever it is, just bring that questioner, that watcher, into focus and start to analyze it. And if it makes you feel bad, that this is the shadow work aspect of that. If it makes you feel bad, to go back and think about how you abused that other person accidentally, unconsciously, or it thinks about, you had an argument with your mom or whatever it was. The shadow work is go back, have the courage, have the will to go through the memories, go through the bad feelings, think about it. How long have you been arguing with your mom like that? And did your brother do it? Did she do that with your father? Oh, did your grandparents do that? Can you track it down in your family line? Can you see how this is a pattern that's been being passed on? Can you see how your relationships keep getting fractured because you keep acting in this same way? Well, go into it. You have to have the courage.
Right?
Why did I do that? Why am I being that? What's behind it? What are the feelings? What are the patterns? And you just start to dig out those automatic behaviors in you that end up being destructive. Or why did I had to do something important and then I ended up taking a hit off the bong or whatever. And I just ended up sitting down watching TV or getting stuffed on ice cream or whatever it is. Go into it, go back to that place. And what was the fear that you were avoiding? What was the discomfort that eating the ice cream and watching TV was numbing, alleviating. So you basically say, wherever I've been being self-destructive or destructive to the world, I'm going to analyze that and try to trace it back, keep a journal, keep a diary, and write it down. That helps process it. And I'm going to self-analyze myself, and I'm going to go into my yucky stuff. I'm going to go clean out my closet. So that's just a practice of awareness and just the willingness to look at and feel feelings that don't feel so good. That's the first thing. It's just an awareness practice. The second thing is what we call emotional processing in shadow work. And this comes from a guy named John Ruskin, who developed it in a little bit different way. But I would say when you're triggered, when you wake up in the morning in a bad mood, that's kind of an unconscious trigger. Or when you're on the road, or when you're your partner says something or does something, whatever it is, you see something in the news and it triggers you and you get an emotional, your heart rate goes up and you get emotionally involved in something and you realize, hey, wait a minute, I shouldn't be getting this emotionally involved. When you've triggered, you've accessed some kind of shadow material in the limbic system, in the feeling state. And that needs to be released. And the analysis part is the frontal cortex part of analyzing. Oh yeah, that memory. Oh yeah, the way I acted. And oh yeah, that's sort of a logical analysis. But that can't be done with feelings. Feelings, emotions, they have to be processed through feeling. And so with that, the emotional processing method is when you're triggered, as soon as you can, if you're triggered in public, you have to wait till you're in private, get in the car, close the door, go park under a tree or whatever, or go home, get on the couch, whatever it is. Allow the memory of what just happened to be with you. The mind will start to distract and just say, no, I'm not going to distract. And you just allow the emotion to fully take over your body. Allow that emotion of rage or of fear or of grief or guilt, shame, whatever the emotion is, shadow emotion, just let it come up and just sit with it and breathe. And never mind what the body or what the mind is doing. Just let it move through your body. And if it's rage, it might make you want to punch something, but you don't. You just hold back and just breathe and just let it move through you. And probably under the rage, there'll be grief or some kind of feminine emotion, and that'll make you cry. And this is where men, actually not just men, women, have to learn to cry. They have to get used to crying. You don't have to cry in public like Jordan Peterson does, but you have to be able to cry in private. And then so you cry and you allow that crying to move the grief or the shame or the fear through you and get released. And then you'll find over time of doing this practice, then the amount of time it takes to process all these emotions will be reduced over time. And your ability to see yourself getting triggered will increase. It doesn't actually mean that you will, it takes a long time. It takes a long time if you've got some kind of pretty good sized wound. It takes a long time to fully move through that. But what you can do is you can go from, in a shorter period of time, you can go from being completely unconscious and being taken over and blaming the world about why you're reactive to being totally conscious of it and going, I can't totally control myself, but I can at least use these triggers to process these old pent-up emotions. And while I'm triggered, I'm aware of it. And I'm able to pull, it's like your vehicle's going off the road, you're able to actually keep your vehicle on the road while you're triggered. And so you can at least relatively easily go from being a complete unconscious, taken over slave to your own internal complexes to being someone who is at least kind of steering it and aware of it and is working on it. And then eventually you get to the point to where you might still be triggered, but you don't have to follow through with the behavior, follow through with the words, follow through with all of the cascade of thoughts and stuff. You can kind of just, okay, that old wound is triggered. All right, there it is. I'm going to breathe. I'm going to allow it to move. I'm not going to take action. And I'm just going to let this move through. And so to eventually, hopefully, not being able to be triggered in that way anymore. And I'm not there yet with my triggers. Okay. I'm to the point to where I can half the time, or maybe more than half the time, I can just not go down that road. And I can watch and I can go, okay, and I can feel the emotions, but then what me and Melissa do is we call a timeout. We can call timeout and that'll just end it right there and then emotionally process it. but sometimes it still does take us over, or take individually or together. And so it's a path. It's a path of healing. It's a way of healing. It's a trajectory that works and that does take you from being, at a level of, it's levels of it's degrees, and it is the right path, and it is a healing path. But I just can't tell you that it's something that you will, in a relatively quick period of time, be able to take control of. But now imagine yourself. Imagine you're 30 years old, 40 years old, 50 years old, whatever it is, and you're still reactive, and you're still triggered, and you're still this way, and you still find yourself binging, or you still find yourself getting into fights, or whatever it is that has to do with your particular complexes. Imagine that now, because people live to be in their 80s now. Imagine you could be a person who is in your 80s and is still just as rude and fucked up as you were in your 40s. Or you can be a person who's in your 80s who actually, it took you 40 years, but you worked it out. Would you rather be an 85-year-old man that worked through a lot of that stuff? And because you were able to work through a lot of that stuff, all kinds of opportunities came to you in life that would not be given to you because you were too immature otherwise. And you had a more fulfilling and filled life because you did work on yourself. Or you can just be sitting around, probably won't last to be 85 years old. You'll probably have a heart attack in your 60s or something like that. And you'll just be miserable, and because you didn't work on yourself. And so it's like, the choice is not whether or not you take this instant cure pill or not. It's a hard road, like anything, but it's way better than not doing it at all. Absolutely.
The time to get started on that is now, sooner than later, folks. And, I recommend checking out Shadow Tech Alchemy and read through this website. These guys have put some beautiful work into this and into this book. And it's obvious a lot of thinking and self-work has gone on your end, Colin. And me too, as well. I don't claim to be there or an expert, but I definitely say there's a lot on the other end for folks to experience in terms of a new level of passion and joy in your life when you do take this on seriously and make it a serious.
That's an important point, actually. Just last thing on that. This is a very important point is that when you're being steered by your own pathology, so to speak, and it's taking you over and you're not fully in control of yourself, you're a victim. You're a victim. You're a victim. And then a lot of people choose to identify with their victimhood, and then now I'm, I have this condition. I am this way. Oh, I have this disease or whatever it is, you're a victim. And when you choose to do the inner alchemy, when you choose to go on the inner hero's journey, even though it's tough, you do make progress, and you do get better, and you do become more functional. And then you also now have a whole mission and purpose and sense of drive, and it activates your warrior capacities, and you have all this aliveness that comes through you because you made the choice to work on yourself. And now you're really on this hero's journey. And every hero is taking hits. So you're still taking hits.
Yeah, but no one said it's going to be easy.
It's not easy, but you can either do that or you can just be a victim.
And like I said before, I think anyone that does really take this seriously will recognize somewhere down the line that that's actually why we're here. And this is our purpose, is to do this work and to discover our inner self and our journey towards what we want to be and the legacy we want to leave behind for other humans So,
and
yeah,
you might not, your path might not be to investigate the shadow of the psyche and figure out all these things and on Jungian psychology and all that. It doesn't mean that. You might use those tools that people that are doing that will give you or whatever. But everybody has, this is the golden shadow. This is the light side of the shadow, which we didn't talk about. The light side of the shadow is your genius that you can't quite see yourself manifesting. It's so bright. It's so powerful. It's so unique that it's having a hard time making its way into your consciousness. That's your highest purpose. And that when you start carving out all this other garbage that's in there and cleaning up all this other garbage, that starts sticking up. That starts making its way into consciousness. And so your genius might be just running some kind of a business, or you talked about entrepreneurism and stuff. And your thing might be, this product or this service or this invention or this art, whatever it is, this music, whatever it is. And you're having a hard time putting that music into the world, that art into the world. And you're having a hard time. Well, once you start carving out all this, processing all this garbage, doing all this shadow work, then basically you're getting in touch with your gold, and you're learning how to be able to, what they say, hold your own gold. And so you're not doing this work so that you can become an expert in shadow work or whatever. You're doing this work so that you can clean out all the garbage that's in the way of you getting to what you are supposed to be doing. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Colin. I really
Thank you, Chris.
Appreciate this time with you today. And
call me back anytime.
Our next talk, and have a wonderful weekend. And we'll be in touch. Thanks, listeners, for tuning in. And that's about it. Have a great day. Much love.
All right. Bye.